So last Friday, I did this talk at the SeaGL Linux conference in Seattle, and this talk is about why Linux doesn't resonate with the mainstream population and how we can try and change that, and what I'm trying to do with my distribution stillOS to do that. But unfortunately, the live stream had some issues. However, I thought it was too important of a talk to not re-record it and post it somewhere, so that's what I'm gonna be doing today. Now, first off, in my opinion, I think it's time for a change. We currently do not have a better experience than Windows or macOS at the moment. However, these experiences have been slowly over time getting worse and worse for most people. So I believe that now is the perfect time that it would take off if a operating system that did provide a better experience than both Windows and macOS came out at the moment. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm probably posting this on my YouTube channel, which has a Linux focused audience. So if you're viewing this, a lot of you may think that Linux does have a better experience than Windows and macOS. And in reality, it has a better experience for power users if you know exactly what you want out of your computer. But for the majority of people, it provides a worse experience. But the thing is, it doesn't have to be like this. Linux has the technology to be a better experience. The reason it isn't yet isn't due to any specific technological issues, but because of usability issues it currently has, branding issues, and targeting issues. So the question I'm trying to ask is how can we make a new operating system that can compete with Windows and macOS? So the biggest problem is Linux does not resonate with most people. So I'm currently a business student at Wazoo, and most of my friends do not know or care what an OS is. What most people want is they just want to be able to get their work done and then either get off their computer and go do something else, or maybe if they're staying on their computer, they're hopping on a video game or watching a show or something. People use their PCs as tools and entertainment devices. And just to reiterate and get this drilled in, most people do not care what an operating system is. This is why I'm currently working on stillOS and trying to found stillHQ and build a company behind it, because I don't think that most Linux developers right now are targeting the right things in order to enter the mainstream population with a Linux system. And that is what I'm trying to change. Now, a lot of people I know are very, very frustrated with Windows, but continue to use it for a variety of reasons. Mainly because it's just what they're familiar with, it's what their computer already runs, and they haven't tried anything else that they like better. However, people still deal with all the ads and bloat that Windows has. People right now are dealing with having to get a new computer for no reason because Windows 11 decided to drop their hardware due to the TPM requirement. And it's all the things like this that is making Windows right now slowly bleed market share against things like macOS. And even Linux has been having its highest market share numbers ever, and also Chrome OS is even building up market share despite being very limited. Now, here are just a few usability problems I have with Windows 11. However, this is just things I can think of, and this is a giant list. So instead of just reading these out, I'm going to show a little video demo of me installing Windows 11 just to show the experience that a lot of people have with Windows 11 that frustrates them. The main takeaway I want you guys to have from that little video snippet I just played is that Windows 11 is trying everything it can to make you the product instead of making itself the product. They're trying to monetize every little snippet of every little penny they can make from you. I don't want to deal with ads on my Windows 11 computer when I am just trying to edit a video for Tux Digital real quick so that I can move on with my night, hang out with some friends, and go to the frats and get drunk. Now, for my real world work, I do use this Mac when I want to do something that I can't do on Linux, especially into music production. And while Linux does have some music production apps, it's just not apps I know how to use, and I don't really want to learn them. But even Macs have usability issues. For example, you are locked into Apple's hardware, and when Apple starts updating your Mac, you are mostly out of luck, especially on the M series CPUs. I also really hate how multitasking works. It feels like a super advanced workflow that came out in 2010 and hasn't been updated since or modernized, but just with a little coat of paint on top with, liquid glass. Also, why does closing a window not close the full app by default? What? Still, even with all these things, it is still a much, much, much better experience than Windows, but it's still not the computing experience I want. Yet, I believe right now macOS is still the best experience for the majority of people because of usability issues with Linux distributions. So Linux has different types of usability problems. And what I want to do is design a distribution that fixes these for your average consumer. Let's start with desktop usability issues. Now, here's a screenshot of KDE. KDE and Gnome are the two biggest desktops and the major ones right now. I do see a future where Cosmic could become a third major player, but right now, none of the other desktops are able to become a major player due to the fact that they do not have app ecosystems. Now, KDE, in my opinion, is the best desktop environment by far, no competition. You can make KDE look like anything, you can customize every aspect of it, and it's very easy to customize it to how you want it to be. And even if you don't want to customize it, the default layout is a very familiar layout that anybody could use. The problem with KDE is its app ecosystem. KDE's app design hasn't really evolved since what feels like 2010. And while a lot of more advanced KDE apps like Krita and Kdenlive are very, very good, a lot of the standard apps just aren't that aesthetically pleasing. They all have different sorts of designs and everything, and there just isn't as much cohesion in the KDE app experience. And I think that is the biggest thing preventing KDE from just easily becoming the #1 desktop. Part of this problem is that Qt pretty much are forced to learn C++ to create a Qt app, because while it does have bindings for other languages, the bindings are just really annoying and not very good to work with. Gnome, on the other hand, has the complete opposite issue. Gnome has by far the best app ecosystem. They're all very coherent, very easy to use. If you know how to use one Gnome app, you can pretty easily figure out how to use every other Gnome app. The biggest problem with Gnome is that the stock Gnome interface just isn't very intuitive for most people. The Gnome team is specifically building the interface that they themselves want to use. But the problem is, for most people, you have to pick up and learn this whole new interface that has a completely different workflow than what you are used to if you're coming from more so Windows, but even Mac OS too. They do things like make it so that by default you only have a close button and no minimize and maximize buttons, and you have to do special system tweaks in order to bring those maximize and minimize buttons back. And just the system layout is just too different from traditional Linux systems. Now, quite a few other distros such as Ubuntu, Zorin OS, and stillOS too, they do modify GNOME in a way that makes it a lot more intuitive for most people to figure out how to use. So Ubuntu is a very good example of this. Yes, it is a different layout than Windows and Mac, but they just design it in a way that's just a lot easier for a normal person to pick up. With the normal GNOME layout, you have people not realizing it's a very workspace-oriented workflow, and they just open all their apps on one workspace and have a mess of apps around. Whereas like an Ubuntu-style layout, that doesn't really matter as much because it works perfectly fine even if you aren't fully utilizing the workspaces. And then, of course, for something like Zorin OS, that's just a Windows-like layout using GNOME tech. So you can just continue to use your normal Windows workflow. Next up, I don't think people realize how big of a burden package managers are for consumer usage of Linux. Package managers at a huge failure point. Now, I'm not saying we should completely get rid of package managers. Package managers are great for power users. If you want to customize your system and build exactly what you want, there's no better way to do it than a package manager on a distro like Arch Linux, or maybe Fedora if you want to have a base system and then make some tweaks. However, they also add a huge failure point that just by itself makes Linux not consumer viable just because of the failure points that package managers add. For example, everybody has had a situation where they install some random Linux app that hasn't been maintained in 8 years, and all of a sudden you have Qt4 dependencies and Qt Creator is now on your system for some reason. If you're updating a lot of packages and let's say your laptop battery dies, that can cause breakages in your computer. And also big distribution updates, especially updates going from like an Ubuntu 22.04 to a 24.04 or a Red Hat 9 to a Red Hat 10. Differences in the tech stack and packages they dropped and dependency issues almost always make it so that you have to do some sort of manual intervention in the upgrade process, or at the very least, something breaks after an update and you have to go and fix it. Luckily for us, the Linux space already has solutions to these problems, and that is Flatpak and Immutable distros. And I put Bootsy here because that is what stillOS is using to solve this problem. Immutable distributions itself, a very exciting and growing space in Linux right now. This is essentially where the OS itself is distributed as one complete package in some way. There's usually a read-only file system, and there's a lot of projects in this space. So you have Fedora Silverblue, which is kind of just a proof of concept of the technology on Fedora, and you have teams like uBlue taking Fedora Silverblue and building very, very good operating system experiences, like Bazzite, for example, which is kind of a SteamOS competitor. You have distributions like GnomeOS, which is able to make a read-only image of everything in the current GNOME stack that GNOME developers can then use as a testing platform. And I think KDE is trying to do something like this too. You have NixOS, where you have everything you want set in a config file, and it creates a installation of your OS that you can then reproduce on any other computer you want by just sending over the config file. It's essentially kind of the arch of immutable distributions, if you will. This type of technology is how we make Linux completely idiot-proof for the mainstream consumer audience. And if you don't believe me, don't just take my word for it, take a billion-dollar corporation's word for it. And that corporation is Valve. This is the type of technology they're using for the Steam Deck. It is why you're able to just go in and boot up SteamOS, and it does updates automatically, and there's never ever breakages or manual interventions or anything, because they are using immutable technology. I think they're using their own system for that, but I could be wrong. But the point is, this is how SteamOS is so damn stable, and how Valve is able to get away with using Linux for a consumer grade product. Next up is the brand image of Linux, and just before I get into this, I just want to tell a story of how I first heard about Linux before I was a Linux user. This was back when I was like 10, so it was maybe 2015, and I remember seeing Linux in like some minimum system requirements thing for a game on Steam, and I went to my stepdad and asked him what Linux was, and he said it's this really obscure operating system that's buggy, unfinished, and just used by nerds. And to this day, that is kind of the brand image that a lot of people think of when they hear the word Linux. They think of some sort of hacker operating system. They think of all the people trying to get you to install Arch. They think of old user interfaces. They think of Linus Tech Tips, his system breaking when he updates Pop! OS. This is an unfortunate truth that the Linux community may need to realize, but in the greater tech space, people who are just a little bit technical, just technical enough to know what Linux is, but have never used it or heard of it, they all have their own bad Linux experience from 2005 that is holding back how they think of Linux in the modern day. It also doesn't help that Linux as a brand encompasses so many different things. There's so many different Linux distros that all fall under Linux branding. For example, I would be willing to bet that a lot of people would have a very good experience running something like Linux Mint. However, you also have these people who recommend Arch Linux, maybe as a troll, maybe because they're just out of touch, and then they have a very bad experience trying out Arch Linux because of how hard it is to install, and that bad experience becomes part of how they see Linux as a whole. Now, this type of culture is part of what makes Linux fun. Like all these little inside jokes that are part of the Linux community, people making their own crazy Linux rices using a window manager, things like that, and just making their desktop really theirs. That's part of why Linux is so fun to use. However, as a brand that just isn't marketable to your normal consumer who is just trying to get their work done and then relax for the day. Now, my solution for this is just that there needs to be a distribution that is very, very consumer friendly, that pushes itself as its own platform separate from the Linux brand. And this is something I will be trying to do with stillOS. But some other examples is Elementary OS has tried this, although they have had mixed success doing this. But some other examples that have been very successful doing this is SteamOS. Valve is able to push so many Steam Deck units, not because they're telling people that it's a Linux-powered device, but because it's a SteamOS-powered device. And they're able to push SteamOS as its own brand that has came off very good due to how well it works and how good of an experience it is. Now, I know it's arguable on if people want to count Chrome OS as a Linux distro, but it does use Linux technology behind the scenes. And that is another example of a brand that people have resonated with. Chrome OS is very easy to use. You don't have to think about it. You can just turn your computer on and use it. whether you like the Google ecosystem or not. And that is how Google and that is how, while Chrome OS has been so restrictive, being a web-focused device, it is still becoming popular in certain industries, especially the education industry. And it's also a popular option if you're trying to give your grandma a computer, for example. Now let's talk about the app problem that Linux has. I believe that this is becoming less and less and less of an issue to Linux adoption. I think for a lot of people, the biggest thing holding Linux back was gaming. However, pretty much every single non-multiplayer game now works on Linux thanks to the Steam Deck and Proton. Additionally, the software industry is moving everything to the web right now. You have things like Microsoft Office Online, you have things like Photoshop Web, and sometimes people even prefer these web versions to native desktop versions. For example, Microsoft Office Web has really taken off at my university, and a lot of people prefer the web version because of all these different collaboration features that make it very good for group projects. And so we're just heading into a future where more and more very common software people use, Figma is another one. All this software is moving to the web. And the thing about the web is it's universal, works on any platform. So how can we take advantage of this? Well, one way you can take advantage of this is by being able to integrate these apps into our Linux systems. But the problem is, at the moment, the integration just isn't very good. Chromium and a lot of the Chromium derivatives do have ways to be able to integrate web applications into your system. However, a lot of the time they have to render their own title bars and they just look really bad. They don't feel like they fit into your system at all. There's also things like ICE and the Linux Mint Web App Manager, which, funnily enough, I used to be a maintainer of ICE, and the Linux Mint team forked ICE into its web app manager, which means it probably uses a bunch of my code. So I am part of the problem here. But what those web app managers do is they basically use different web browsers and hijack them and do sort of a hacky approach, making a site-specific browser where all of the browser Chrome is hidden and it's just a title bar and everything. But sometimes you have web apps that do need back and forward buttons that do not work very well with these solutions. And other times, especially if it's like a social media site like Instagram, you click a link that goes to an external website, and instead of opening it in your default web browser, it instead opens another one of these site-specific windows that don't have window controls, and just completely breaks the immersion. Now, one of the things I love the most about my Mac is the way it does web app integration. Believe it or not, this screenshot right here is actually a web app. But macOS is able to do things like detect the background color it uses for sidebar and everything and make the window border match that color. So it makes it just feel like a very, very native app, while still being able to give you things like your back and forward buttons and use browser extensions. Now, a solution to this I am trying out with stillOS is a web runtime I made called SWI. With this, you take a YAML file, which is a specification of a web app, and it lets you turn a web application into a native feeling desktop experience. And with this, we can do something like put Microsoft Office Online on our store, and people can install them as native feeling web apps. And it even has features like, with the Office ecosystem, for example, if you go into OneDrive and open up a PowerPoint, it will be able to detect that it's actually a PowerPoint app and open it in the PowerPoint app instead of the Word app. So you don't have any of these weird inconsistencies, and it's just a very good experience. Now, this is something I want other distributions to be able to implement, but unfortunately at the moment we do have to patch Gnome, and the patches are SWI specific, so I doubt any other distros are going to want to patch Gnome just for this one feature. However, I do believe just the entire software industry moving to the web like this is a very big opportunity for a Linux desktop. However, even without app support, I believe that Linux can catch up even without common apps. This is a screenshot of 2002 macOS. Yes, it did have big apps such as Microsoft Office even back then, but at the time, it still didn't have very many apps that many people in certain industries needed to run. Because of this, at this time, Windows was able to have 97% market share. And back then, macOS only had 1.43% market share. But Apple was able to turn this around by just making an operating system that was a very, very good experience to use and integrated well between Apple hardware and things. At the time, they had the iPod. And just by building the best experience, Windows went from 97, and just from building the best experience, you had Mac going from a 1.43% market share back then to now 18% market share today. Of course, these are different ways of counting market share, and so take these exact numbers with a grain of salt. But the point I'm trying to make is macOS went from a very, very obscure thing in 2002 to now being a dominant platform in the mainstream that people love using. And like I said, this was even without good app support in 2002, back when macOS was more obscure. Another example of this is Chrome OS. Chrome OS can run Android apps and web apps, but there's no desktop app experiences that are built specifically for native Chrome OS. Even then, other Linux distributions, Windows and Mac, also had decades of a head start, and Chrome OS today is still sitting at 1.34% market share, and you see schools adopting Chrome OS, university students using Chromebooks, and especially in America, Chrome OS is now something that is used by the mainstream. Now, even if Linux was a completely perfect platform, people still have to go and install their own OS in order to use Linux. And so how do we actually get a Linux distribution that is able to do this, such as stillOS, into the hands of regular people? Well, we just need to get Linux in front of more and more people. Now, a small Linux hardware company like System76, unfortunately, doesn't have the resources to do something like put all their devices out in a Best Buy, like a Chromebook can, for example. But there's a lot of other ways that we can get Linux out into mainstream users. The biggest thing though is we need more hardware selling that has Linux on it. Now, this is something I want to do very, very long term, but I can't do at the moment due to just resources. But I'm envisioning having like a Steelbook, kind of like a MacBook type situation that runs stillOS, and it's a full coherent experience. But to get people, and I want to be able to sell it through stillOS itself. So once people try out stillOS and realize that it is a better experience than their Windows computer or their Mac computer, they can go and buy an official stillOS piece of hardware and not have to deal with installing stillOS themselves. But how do we get stillOS out in the first place to get these types of users to use it and enjoy it? Well, I think hardware recycling centers is a very good place to start. Not only are we helping people by distributing stillOS computers from refurbished recycled computers, but it gets stillOS in front of people, and then eventually when they turn things around and they're able to buy their own computer that is a lot better, they may consider buying a stillOS laptop, or it doesn't have to be stillOS, just any laptop with a Linux system on it. Another way to get stillOS in front of consumers is to use it for things like deployment in computer labs, small business IT and small business offices, for example. Get all of those running stillOS. The employees then have to use stillOS for their job and then realize that they actually like the experience better than their Windows or Mac OS computer, and then go and figure out how to turn their Windows computer into a stillOS computer and go through the install process, or just they buy another computer if they don't want to go through that. And then another thing is just shipping out more Linux devices, like the Steam Deck, for example. Going back to what my stepdad said about Linux 10 years ago that I talked about earlier, now he has a Steam Deck. He's went into desktop mode on a Steam Deck and gotten emulators working on it and loves the Linux experience now, and he's considering giving it another shot. So even in the case of the Steam Deck, where we're not getting a Linux distro out that is made for general use, but a very niche specific Linux distro aimed at the hardware it's on, it really can change people's perceptions of Linux here. So with that, I'm just going to summarize how my distribution is trying to do this. It's going to be a new brand that is not tied to or marketed with the Linux brand itself. It's just going to market itself as an entirely new thing that just happens to share a Linux tech stack and a Gnome tech stack. We're also using heavy web app integration as a stopgap for apps. We're going to be focusing heavily on stability in the user experience. For example, I'm shipping a custom Gnome layout that I have been testing on other students at my university to see how they figure it out. We're using an atomic immutable file system, in this case using bootc technology and Flatpak for app distribution. And then we're just going to be trying our best to get Linux in front of people. I don't have the resources yet to be developing my own Linux devices and hardware, but I will be working with recycling centers to get stillOS pre-installed on them, as well as long-term, I will be trying to get stillOS into things like computer labs and get it into small business IT services. With that, I have been developing stillOS by myself for 2 years, which is why I haven't been uploading on this YouTube channel, and I am looking for contributions. So if you're interested in that, go to the stillHQ website and join the Discord and just reach out. It doesn't have to be programming. We have several other things that we need contributors on. Like we want to make a app store experience that has things like articles on new apps coming out from the community, and we need documentation, even just new ideas that can help push our mission of stillOS. It can be very good contributions. Aside from that, I don't want to be the only person doing this. If there's another distribution that copies all of the ideas I had in this presentation and does it better than me, that's something I want. I'm trying to innovate in the space. So this is a call to the Linux community to design for everyone, not just us as Linux users. Build for the top 90%, which would be students, families, offices, creators. Prioritize stability and ease of use. Treat the web as a first-class citizen, and meet people where they are, whether that's stores, labs, or refurb channels. With all that, thank you for watching this video. Sorry for some of the mic quality. Like, I didn't plan on recording this and putting it on YouTube. I was planning on SeaGL just uploading this talk, and I haven't done YouTube in a long time. But with that, if you have any questions or thoughts, you can leave a comment in this YouTube video or email me at the email listed here. But I will be answering questions in the comments of this video. But I hope I changed some people's perspectives on things, on a lot of the problems Linux has right now that people aren't talking about, as well as just how some of the tech coming out of the Linux space, such as Flatpak, immutable file systems, things like that, could be utilized in a way that can actually create the first ever year of the Linux desktop. So with this, let's go and make 2026 the year of the Linux desktop.